Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the all-new Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another entry here. This one based on one of your newer suggestions. This one having to do with a fascinating case because I have heard of this name before. I've just never gone into the details associated with the person behind it. It's one of those things where you hear something throughout your years, and then finally you have a chance to actually go into the rich history tied to it. Such is the case here with this particular lifelong gangster who had a very interesting moniker, and when I was reading his information, it was fascinating to see the parallels associated with the video I just covered the other day, the one involving Alvin Creepy Carpus, and I'll mention that more here in a minute, and why you'll see how they almost are intertwined with each other. But it has to do with this. You're looking at the gentleman now. His real name was George Kelly Barnes, but as always, he went by a moniker, a more famous one, and it was called Machine Gun Kelly. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating info associated with this lifelong gangster. So who was this George Kelly Barnes, aka Machine Gun Kelly? Well, he was someone that was born back on July 18th, 1895, there in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, as far as his earliest life, like let's say during his childhood and maybe during his teen years, I don't really have much info on that. I imagine not much happened during that time period. Instead, let's talk about when it was the 1920s and the 1930s. This would have placed him around the mid-20s or so, starting from there. This was during the Prohibition era. This was, of course, the time period where it was illegal to have any kind of liquor or other type of drinks associated with it, but it definitely created a prosperous time for bootleggers. Those that were in the mafia, those that were gangsters, they definitely made sure to keep the wine flowing. And so when that happened, Machine Gun Kelly worked as a bootlegger, not just for himself, but he also had another colleague, and they were able to do so for a good time period. It seemed like they were successful in making some tidy profit for themselves, and then doing so, avoiding several run-ins with the law. At the time, they were in the Memphis area specifically, but things were getting a little heated during that time period, and so he actually left town, heading west, and then at that point, he had a girlfriend that he took with him. He was also able to change his name. Apparently, he changed it to George R. Kelly. I'm wondering how that happens, because if I imagine like there, he already had several run-ins with the law. Makes you wonder how someone is able to then change their name. Wouldn't there be some kind of thing blocking it? In other words, whenever something shows up in terms of crimes or some other type of item that would just say, hey, wait a minute, you can't change your name because of the crimes you committed before. But who knows? At least that was done. But if anyone has any more on that, let me know, please. But yes, he still did his fashion when it came to committing bootlegging crimes. He was doing that still here and there. In fact, at one point, he was arrested in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1928 because he was visiting an Indian reservation trying to smuggle some liquor into it. At that point, he was sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth Penitentiary there in Kansas. And when he was released, this was a pivotal time in his life because he met this person right afterward. Her name was Catherine Thorne, and she ended up being actually a very influential person in her life. In fact, she was the one who purchased Machine Gun Kelly's first ever machine gun. Apparently, Machine Gun Kelly didn't like having weapons on him. Not only was it, I guess, for practical purposes, but also for liability purposes, because it's one thing if you commit a crime without any kind of weapon, but the same crime happens and you're caught with a weapon, then that could increase the fines, and not only that, but the sentences associated with jail. But still, he was able to take that machine gun and then practice along the countryside with her and become very familiar with the actual device. And then at that point, apparently, they decided to influence their names within the underground crime area. Somewhere along the way, though, cut to around 5 years later, and then that's when Machine Gun Kelly's name took a whole different turn. And it has to do with this. You're looking at this gentleman now. His name was Charles F. Urschel. And apparently at that time in Oklahoma City, he was considered an oil tycoon and a very influential businessman. So he definitely had money. He definitely had notoriety. And so when that happened, somewhere along the lines, Machine Gun Kelly and then his wife at that point, Catherine Thorne, they decided to kidnap him, and then apparently another person by the name of Walter R. Jarrett, and they held them ransom for $200,000, which today would have been $4 million. When I was reading this information, I was thinking again, oh my goodness, this sounds familiar. Just like with the other video, Alvin Creepy Karpis, he in turn also kidnapped not just one prominent person, but a second prominent person, and they too ended up holding them ransom for $200,000, which again is about $4 million today. So interesting, right? Whenever that's the case, here you have two separate gangsters, both of them practically doing the same thing. And apparently they were able to do so successfully. So Machine Gun Kelly held this person, this influential, wealthy tycoon, ransom, and they got paid. They got the money. Interestingly enough, though, this yet again would be their undoing, just like it was with Alvin Creepy Karpis and the last kidnapping of the influential person there. And that one was the friend that ended up being a friend of the president, and of course that turned all the heat on when it came to tracking Alvin Creepy Karpis down. Such was the case here. So once the ransom was paid and then Urshel was released, the FBI definitely got into it. They wanted to make sure that the kidnapping of anyone, let alone influential people, would not go unimpeded. And so there was a full-blown investigation. Agents pretty much all went down into that area to try to find out, start from scratch, seeing what occurred. Interestingly enough, though, this guy, Charles F. Urshel, the oil tycoon that was kidnapped, he definitely was had doing some quick thinking when he was kidnapped, because even though he was blindfolded, it turns out he was making mental notes of his surroundings. Like, for example, he was remembering a lot of the background noises, a lot of the background sounds that were in his area. Also, he was counting footsteps. So anytime he was taken somewhere and he recorded in his mind what the sounds were, he was also making sure to note how many footsteps it took to go from point A to point B. And then the last thing he did was he also left a bunch of fingerprints everywhere. He wanted to make sure that when he was released, he could kind of point people in the right direction. And then once they found his fingerprints, once the FBI and other law enforcement found those fingerprints, then it was almost like finding footprints, like it was following one point to another point, and then that's where they would lead to Machine Gun Kelly. And it worked. Apparently, the agents concluded that originally Charles F. Urshel was held there in Paradise, Texas, all because of the self-evidence that he provided. And so eventually there was tracking done. Special agents came on board. Again, they all wanted to find out essentially what occurred. And when they found the solution, they were able to realize that they were being held somewhere there again in Memphis. Like, in other words, Machine Gun Kelly and others were there in Memphis somewhere around 1933. So there was a raid that was conducted, and I don't think there was any shooting, not like the other big raid that I just mentioned in the other video involving Alvin Creepy Karpis. In this case, though, it seemed like Machine Gun Kelly and his wife, Catherine Thorne, they were basically caught up in a corner, and then they surrendered. They didn't shoot anything as far as I could tell. And in fact, they surrendered quite visibly. Like, in other words, according to either a legend or truth, they apparently shouted, "Don't shoot, G-men! Don't shoot, G-men!" like as they were surrendering to the FBI agents. They knew they didn't want to get hurt, in other words, during any kind of potential shootout. That's one particular quote-unquote myth associated with it. Another one mentions this. Apparently, Machine Gun Kelly did have some kind of gun in his hand, but he was about to do something when he realized all of a sudden an agent or someone creeped up next to him and had a shotgun placed straight at his heart. Obviously, if Machine Gun Kelly did anything at that point, then he would have gotten a full shotgun blast straight into his heart. And so he gave up at that point, stating something on the lines of, "I've been expecting you." But that's another area. And yet another version states that, again, it was just they were found in the bedroom corner of the home that they were in, and they had their hands raised. And I think that that's the most sensible one. Like, I think if it would have been a raid, especially really quiet, and then they would have realized that they were cornered, I think that they wouldn't have made a lot of fuss, especially if they considered their lives very important at that point. And so I think the third one is the most likely one. In any case, though, they were arrested, and then they were brought forth into a courthouse, and then that's where they were in turn given, on October 12th, 1933, a full life imprisonment, not just for Machine Gun Kelly, but also for his wife, both of them. them. And then also the wife's mother and stepfather were also arrested because it turns out they were the ones that were housing not just the money, but I think also Charles F. Urschel, whenever he was kidnapped, they used that location, that the mother or the stepfather's house, as the imprisonment. So someone might, if I'm wrong on that, please someone correct me, but at least that's how I was reading that information. And I think they were able to find about 73,000 or so of the ransom money, and so that was also collected within that time period. But if you're wondering, in terms of a full life imprisonment for both of them, Machine Gun Kelly and then also his wife, why that was so severe, apparently it turns out that this was due to the Lindbergh Law. It apparently made kidnapping a federal crime, and so this was the very first case tried ever right after that new law was enacted. So there they were, essentially being the first examples of anyone else. If they're interested in doing any kind of kidnapping, they're going to get slammed hard with a very severe case such as this, like a very severe sentencing. Not only that, but this was also the first major case that J. Edgar Hoover had, and this was also the very first time that film cameras were allowed. So I'm wondering if that was also an influence too, because again, it was almost like they were made an example associated with it. So Machine Gun Kelly spent the next 21 years or so also in Alcatraz. Doesn't that sound familiar, right? Like when it comes to Alvin Creepy Karpis, he too was there. But yes, he spent 21 years there, and instead the inmates ended up calling him Pop Gun Kelly, because as it turns out, he was one that was giving a lot of exaggerated, bravado-like tales about his exploits, and then the prisoners clearly saw through the ruse, and they were realizing that he wasn't really the brutal gangster that he was made out to be. Instead, it seemed like it was the media, and then maybe the tales of his wife, and even if the FBI that were stating this, as opposed to who was the person in front of them. In fact, it turns out he became a model citizen, a model prisoner within Alcatraz, and then shortly after that, actually before his death, he was quietly transferred back to Leavenworth and ended up dying in 1951 there in prison at the age of 59. And if you want to know where he's buried now, you can go here to Cottondale, Texas, and there's a cemetery there, and you can see as it looks like today. He was buried under the moniker George B. Kelly, 1954. So anyone interested in the world of Mafia and gangsters, if you want to see a real-life gangster where they're buried today, that's the case here with that tombstone. If you're wondering what happened to the wife, too, she ended up actually being released from prison back in 1958, and she changed her name. She changed her name under Lara Cleo Kelly. Again, it brings up that interesting question I was asking earlier. If someone has a very strong federal crime associated with them, how are they allowed to change their name to another name, because that could be dangerous to any place that they're living or going to, and so on. So if someone has that info, let me know. But she ended up living in Oklahoma City, if I'm not mistaken, and she led a quiet life as a bookkeeper, ended up dying at the age of 81. So how about that? Imagine if you were there in Oklahoma City during a time up to the mid-80s, you might have had actually a real-life gangster's wife helping you there when it came to your bookkeeping needs. But that's pretty much it. That's all the info associated with Machine Gun Kelly. Obviously, his name has gone on to be a pretty popular one. There's a musician by the name of Colson Baker who has ended up taking that stage name and creating it to a whole other level. So now Machine Gun Kelly is infamously tied not just with the gangster, but also with this musician. But if anyone has any more info, anything else I might have missed, please post those comments below. Anybody from that Oklahoma area, maybe you've gone and seen that particular tombstone, I would love to go see it. It would be a chance to check out real life history, to be able to go there and then see something like that involving real life gangsters tombstone. But if anyone has that particular experience, please post in the comments below. All right, everyone. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.